Welcome back to Tree Lady Talks. Last season, this happened.
Called Julian Forbes Laird!
Now that's Julian Forbes Laird, and he did two very popular episodes indeed. Season 2, Episode 7 and Season 2, Episode 18, Just Another Thing and a case update. And at the end of that, we gave people the right to reply. And stand back in amazement, somebody actually did. So Sharon, who is this mystery person?
So welcome to Jon Heuch. Jon, thank you so much for joining us on Tree Lady Talks. Jon, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Well, I'm coming to the end of the first part of my career, at least. I've been practicing in forestry and arboriculture for approaching 40 years. And since 2012, I've been a full-time arboricultural consultant. But before that, first experience of legal matters, the European Union employed me to be a law enforcement officer, or expert even, in Indonesia, and said, go and spend 25 million euros. And the Indonesian government wanted motorboats and machine guns. And it led to me chasing poachers in the highlands of Kenya and finding strange amphibious vehicles in the Peruvian Amazonian forest as they looked for barons growing coca. Very exciting.
That sounds amazing. I thought my time was exciting trotting up and down Caledonian Road in Islington, but that is really out there. How wonderful.
I can tell you it's a lot rougher on Caledonian Road. But anyway, TPO prosecutions and the like are a little bit more mundane, but at the same time can provide a little bit of adrenaline at times. But so that's me. I've got to know the TPO system fairly well, and having a forestry background, I've got an understanding of what forestry is all about. And for the last few years, I've been maintaining the RICS website on tree preservation orders and high hedges. And a component of that has involved looking at felling licenses and the interaction of the two.
Well, Jon, thank you so much. They are both still online, so all of our podcasts are still online. But we released this one recently because Julian had the result of the court case. And I really appreciated you phoning me a few days ago to say that you wanted to put your point of view across. And we always welcome a right to reply here at Tree Lady Talks. So, Jon, I know this is something that you're very experienced and knowledgeable about and passionate about. It's over to you.
Thanks, Sharon. Well, I'm in a rather fortunate position in the sense that in March 2020, the case that Julian describes came to me a couple of days before there was due to be a hearing at the local Crown Court. And it was intriguing because it came to me with reports, or at least advice, from 3 separate arboricultural consultants, all of whom said pretty much sort of similar things, but with different degrees of confidence and different degrees of rigor. But I was given all the paperwork, and then I was told that the defendant had sacked their lawyers, and that was the end of my involvement, even though what I told the barrister actually wasn't to their liking. But the other aspect to this was that as an assessor for the ICF for new prospective members in arboriculture, I'm always quite surprised at how little new members know about felling license when they come with an arboricultural hat on. They have no or very little experience. And even when you ask them directly as to, how trees can be protected, the words felling license doesn't come out very often. They have to be prodded. So Court cases can be complex. Inevitably, there are lots of red herrings and interesting points which are worthwhile spending time on, but may or may not be crucial. And in this case, there are a whole variety of issues which I won't raise because we'll be here all night. And the only specific issue we need to consider is this interaction between the Forestry Act, 1967, and the Town and Country Planning Act, 1990. And the Forestry Act has been around for over 50 years. And the Town and Country Planning Act has been around for over 30 years. And these two acts, rightly or wrongly, have been working together without too many problems. So it was a little bit surprising to hear that this case had led to some new ground or done something unusual. And it was quite funny to read the website of Goatley solicitors who claim, and I think Julian may have mentioned them, who were involved in the case. And their website reads, "If you go down to the woods today, you may be in for a big surprise." It goes on, "This case has created a fascinating legal matrix, which when pursued to its logical conclusion, produces an unexpected result." Quite surprising. So I picked up my 2 volumes of Charles Miner's Law of Trees, thinking, well, there must be something in here about this issue. Not a dicky bird. Surprising. I looked up the old Blue Book and saw what they had to say about the matter. And then I looked at the history of the Forestry Act to see whether that could give us any indication of what's gone on. And of course, in 1967, when the Forestry Act first came into force, the Forestry Commission received a copy of every single tree preservation order that was served in the country. I reckon they must have had about 100,000 tree preservation orders clogging up their offices. And as the rules changed, they got rid of all of those. They sent them off to the National Archives, and the National Archives put all but a very small number in the bin. But from that time, if we look at the 1969 tree regulations and the model order, you look at a TPO that was served at that time, there's a note at the bottom of the model order, first page, saying, if you need a felling license for protected trees, you need to apply to the Forestry Commission for a felling license. That was there up front on every single TPO that had been served correctly. But by 1999, with the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 and the new model order, those words disappeared. And you have to work quite hard to look at 1990 and 1999 regulations to actually get a reminder that you're meant to be dealing with the Forestry Act at the same time. And I think institutional memory has probably forgotten this issue to some degree. But that's probably the history behind it. And so we now have a situation where the Forestry Commission has been reorganized and reorganized and reorganized. And when I left university, I think they had 8,000 members of staff. I don't know, or even 10,000 members of staff. I don't know how many they have now. But they're faced with an act that hasn't changed, but the act says very clearly what to do when a felling license is required for trees protected by a TPO. And it says, here we are, Forestry Act 1967, if an application is made for a felling license in respect of trees, if they propose, the Forestry Commission as it is shall give notice in writing to the authority that made the tree preservation order. The onus is on the Forestry Commission to tell the local authority that there is a felling license application, and does the council have anything to say in the next 28 days? That's the time period they've got. And this case has a number of complexities, which I won't really go into in too much detail. Julian has made some remarks about the Highways Agency and the felling license. The only important thing to note is that there was a felling license, and it had the standard words at the time, which said that if you haven't told us about the TPO, this doesn't cover protected trees. And whilst that is interesting, that was standard wording for felling licenses at the time. It does appear that the Forestry Commission has, from time to time, altered its documentation and its wording, both of the felling licenses it issues and of the guidance it produces. And it's a little bit confusing if you try and work out what is going on, because the wording I've just referred to isn't on felling licenses I've got from the beginning of this year. But to cut to the main point, Julian has made some points, specific points, about, in this particular case, about the Forestry Act 1967. He has made the statement. If I get into the fine detail, Forestry Act 1967, section 15(5), has the effect of removing jurisdiction over the felling of trees subject to a TPO from the local authority and vesting it wholly within the regime set out in Forestry Act 1967. That's partly correct, but it's misleading. It's misleading because the Forestry Act 1967 very clearly does lay out what needs to happen, but it doesn't remove the jurisdiction from the local authority at all. It puts the local authority very much in the driving seat, because the Forestry Commission has to consult with the local authority, and if the local authority wants to object, it gets removed from the Forestry Commission and the Town and Country Planning Act comes into force. So I don't know where Julian got that from or why he has made a point of it, but it doesn't seem right to me. And related to that, there is this issue, the wording, which says that the Forestry Act disbars local authorities from even entertaining an application under a TPO. The difficulty is that he hasn't quoted the whole clause. Section 15(5), which Julian has quoted for, and of course it does sound it does sound quite interesting when it says no relevant application shall be entertained in respect of the felling of trees. And what he's missed out is the clause that starts that section, which reads, except as provided by the foregoing provisions of this section, as in the first part of the Forestry Act, section 15, describes what should happen if a forestry license is required for protected trees. And it starts 15.1. It says 15.1, if an application is made for which consent under the tree preservation regulations are required. It says that, it doesn't say that the Forestry Commission just make the decision. It says that the felling license is required and consent is required from the local authority and it's a joint process. And the Forestry Act 1967 had to go somewhere. It's in the Forestry Act. It describes what process needs to be followed. For the local authority to grant permission, the person has to apply for a felling license with the Forestry Commission, and the Forestry Commission then has to inform the local authority of this application and ask them what they think about it. And there's a twin or two methods. One is if the Forestry Commission intend to to grant a license, they will ask the local authority for their views, and it's what's called a notification. They give notice to the local authority. If the Forestry Commission aren't at all concerned as to whether these trees get cut down or not, they will refer the application. If they refer the application, they just say, it's over to you, local authority, you do with it under the Town and Country Planning Act. If we're not going to grant a felling licence.
So just to interrupt you there, so the Forestry Commission is making that decision. The local authority cannot make that decision. So the local authority are either notified or they're referred to.
Absolutely.
They don't have control. They can't say, they can say during the notification process, oh, we object to this.
Yes.
And if they're referred, they can't say, actually, we don't care either. Take it back. They then have to deal with it. But in other words, the Forestry Commission, to put it really simply, is a master in this situation.
It's a master only in that it has a choice. It's not it's not a master in terms of it's going to do something else. And essentially, as a woodland officer said to me, if there's a commercial crop of trees in the ground that has been planted with a view to producing timber, that's the whole role of the Forestry Commission. You know, they're there to support that person to fell the trees. That might be sweet chestnut coppice. You know, that might be plantation at regular intervals. But essentially, the Forestry Commission is there to maintain that stock of timber. And if someone wants to cut it down with a view to replanting forestry, they don't really want a tree preservation order to get in the way.
Can I say also, remind listeners that felling licenses are not just for woodlands. They protect any more than 5 cubic metres of timber in a calendar quarter in an area which is not a garden, not a public open space or certain types of them, not an orchard and not a graveyard. So in other words, a inner city, not London, but an inner city industrial estate with, say, 20 poplars on it, which need to be felled, maybe they've just outgrown their situation, that requires a felling licence. And I think that's where people forget. They tend to equate felling licences with rural situations, but it does apply to all urban areas apart from inner London boroughs. And the actual felling licence application process is not as intuitive for those geographical situations. You know, if you're trying to do a compartment of scattered poplar trees on an industrial estate, for example, it's quite tricky. But I just wanted to bring in the other context where felling licenses apply. Would you agree, Jon?
I'm glad you brought it up, and I'm glad you started with the word protect, because it's very important to remember that the Forestry Commission felling license regime is not there to protect trees. They are there to maintain the whole reason for the Forestry Commission. Clearly, the forestry is now a more complex beast, but the whole reason Forestry Act 1967 and in 1951, when felling license started after the Second World War, is to maintain a stock of timber.
Yes.
And all they are doing with a felling license is regulating that flow of timber. And as I say, forestry is now more complex, but they're not there to protect trees. And if you read the Forestry Act, there is almost a presumption that a felling license will be granted to cut trees down. Clearly, tree preservation order, the last thing we want is a tree to be cut down. But so there is a clash there, and that's why relying on a felling license to protect trees is not a good idea at all. The Forestry Commission are almost obliged to grant felling licenses, providing sustainable forestry is planned, provided environmental regulations apply, they're not going to sit there and say, oh, these trees are pretty, you can't cut them down.
No, so they come from completely different angles. So, the absolute foundation of the Town and Country Planning Act is, in essence, visual amenity. And the absolute essence of the felling licence regulations 1967, which is a very good year, by the way, is timber production. But I think that gets clouded in our current culture of visual amenity, ecosystem services, climate change. But they are the two different, they're not opposed, they can be in harmony, but they're the two different viewpoints. But I use the word protect in that if those, let's take these hypothetical 20 poplar trees in, let's say, Liverpool city centre industrial estate, for example, if those trees are felled, they do not have a tree preservation order on them, let's say, they're not in a conservation area, but they are felled without a felling licence, and I suggest that's quite a common scenario, there's potential for prosecution. And
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
And interestingly, John, what's even more perhaps a penalty than a criminal record and a fine is a restocking notice. And now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the restocking notice is not let's plant another 20 poplars. It's to replant the equivalent canopy cover or density of woodland cover in the area. So in effect, you sanitise that site from development with new planting.
Yeah, I think we could easily get sidetracked into what what does the Forestry Commission do in these circumstances, and I think I cannot answer definitively on what they do in those circumstances. I really can't. I don't know the full story as to how they. I mean, there are obviously limited resources, and I imagine that they are focused to some degree on their bog standard forestry management.
Hey, that's for another. I digress because it is fascinating. I have got experience of my own case, not on something that I was directly involved in at the time, where a restocking notice was served on a site, which in effect sanitised it from development, even though it was in the local plan for residential development. But that is something I should just give a teaser to and never expand upon. John, over to you. You're being a very good chair here because you're trying to keep to the point and I'm rambling.
Look, I can ramble for a long time, but I go back to this solicitor's website because they are obviously, I assume, that, they were in the courtroom. I wasn't in the courtroom. I'm not party to all the fine detail. I'm just looking at the interaction of these two acts as I understand it, and I feel this court case may have gone off track a little bit because the solicitor's website, makes comment that the intention of Parliament had been clear, and the TPO regime was intended to be subservient to the felling regime. Well, that's not the case. There is an interaction between forestry and tree preservation orders, and forestry, mainstream forestry, undoubtedly wasn't meant to be restricted by the TPO regime. But that doesn't make it subservient. And certain Section 15 of the Forestry Act says very clearly that it's not forestry that has the upper hand. It's the local authority with TPOs, because they can object. They can take all the felling licenses and say, we object to them on our protected trees, and we will make our mind up on them. And so this website says the only exception would be where a felling license was made and then referred for consultation. No, that is one of the two options that the Forestry Commission has. So we have this complex case. We have a complex case where a felling license has been issued, but the local authority hasn't been informed that there was a felling license application. And the local authority clearly has all sorts of complicating factors behind the case because there's been a lot of activity. And they obviously thought, well, if we haven't given permission for these works, then the people can be prosecuted. Sounds quite logical. But there is this next section of the Forestry Act, section 15.6, which says that where a felling license has been granted, in the case of where trees are protected by a TPO, and the felling license postdates the TPO, the license shall, notwithstanding anything in that order, be sufficient authority for the felling of any trees to which the order relates. And it's pretty difficult to argue against that, but I will, because the potential implications for TPOs is huge. If I want to fell your poplar trees, or I was going to use an example of some nice big veteran oak trees around a field which someone wants to develop and which are protected by a TPO, I go to the Forestry Commission, put in a felling license application, don't tell the Forestry Commission that there's a TPO on them. They grant the felling license, and I get my chainsaw out and start cutting the trees down. Local people call up the tree officer. The tree officer comes along and says, you can't do that. These trees are protected. And I say, I've got a felling license. Well, we all know where that's going. Well, we don't know where it's going, but this person has said, I've got a felling license, and that trumps the TPO. So why would anybody bother to tell the Forestry Commission that there's a TPO? Well, there's a very good reason, because section 15.6 of the Forestry Act has to be read with the rest of section 15. You can't pluck out one part of section 15 and wave it around, having ignored sections 15.1, 15.2, 15.3, 15.4, and 15.5. 15.6 is a component of section 15. And there are regulations related to the Forestry Act. And the regulations say the applicants have to provide X, Y, and Z. And if the applicants haven't provided X, Y, and Z, or if they deliberately or unconsciously failed to declare a TPO, you can't then come along and say, this says the felling license trumps the TPO, because they haven't followed the due process.
So in other words, the applicant, your veteran tree owner client, has been dishonest on the form.
Yeah, they may be dishonest. They may be the Forestry Commission itself used the word fraudulent in one of their many guidance notes, which appear the word has disappeared now, but it was for a time fraudulent. They could be fraudulent. They might have phoned up the local council and got the message that there wasn't a TPO. Or then, if you're asking about a field and someone on the telephone in the local authority wants to know the address, and you say, well, it's the field at the end of the road if you turn left here and all of that, you may get a verbal message. Yes, you might put in a land charge query, but all the same, the standard way of finding out if there's a TPO is you phone up the local authority and you ask. So there are all sorts of reasons why the TPO might get missed in the felling license application. And if you go to the Blue Book, the old Blue Book, it anticipated that might happen, and it suggested to tree officers that they might want to, keep in touch with the Forestry Commission, watch what they were up to, because TPOs might be missed. Clearly, that's quite a challenge, and I don't think it's quite the best way of going about it. But that's what's in the Blue Book. So I'm saying I'm arguing against this clause, which says that the felling license trumps the TPO, because the implications for TPOs could be huge. And I raise the point, which is probably more known to listeners, and that is of the TPO, that is not quite right, in that it may not be confirmed. We know what a non-confirmed TPO is. It's worthless. We know if the council hasn't followed the correct procedure to raise the TPO. So, for example, they may have confirmed it before the 28 days statutory consultation process is over. I've had a few that have been confirmed almost on the same day that they were served. In those circumstances, the TPO is not valid. Now, we know that Section 284 of the Town and Country Planning Act makes it very difficult for us to go to a council and force them to look at a TPO that has got errors in it and to tell them that they've got to do something about it. The local council can sit on a TPO and say the tree is protected. And because we know that Section 284 says that the validity of the TPO cannot be questioned in any legal proceedings whatsoever. But a felling licence that has been generated by the Forestry Commission, where they haven't followed the due process, that is, they haven't followed the process very clearly laid out in Section 15, whether the Forestry Commission know that, I mean, I hope that they don't follow another process if they know that there is a TPO. I'm assuming it's just ignorance that maybe the applicant hasn't ticked the box saying there's a TPO. But if a felling licence emerges out of that process and the Forestry Commission haven't followed due process, how can it be valid? The difficulty is that if the Forestry Commission are happy with the felling licence and the applicant is happy with the felling licence, they're not going to question it until the local authority get wind of it, which may be too late, depending on where the trees are and what's going on. A local resident may not know about it at all, because this is far too complex for us, let alone for the members of the public. Then the Forestry Commission website says the felling licence can't be altered after it has been issued. I bet it can if it got put in front of a judge. But anyway, the implications for TPOs, I mean, woodland TPOs in particular, but as you mentioned poplars, I mentioned oak trees, anything outwith of a garden, a churchyard, and requires a felling licence. And someone, if this is the law, could come along and get a felling licence and then walk down the street and say, you can't prosecute me, local authority. So I don't honestly believe it will stand up to scrutiny, but there we are. The Forestry Commission has got some explaining to do in the sense that their guidance has changed so frequently. But the basic problem is that the Forestry Commission need to know whether the trees in a felling licence are protected by a TPO or not. And I think there's room for improvement in that, whether it means that every felling licence the Forestry Commission has got to consult the local authority. You mentioned in the podcast that local authorities used to get weekly or monthly lists, whatever they are. They were regularly informed, and I can't see why that can't happen. It's very easy to work out which local authority is, and if they send those lists through once a week or whatever, local authorities could look at them rather than looking on a website which possibly doesn't say which local authority is involved. It should be for the Forestry Commission to implement the law as set out, for them to work out whether there is a tree preservation order in place or not allow applicants to tick the no box unless there is some very clear evidence. Maybe the applicant needs to have written confirmation from the local authority that there is no tree preservation order on these trees. Maybe that's another way, makes it a bit easier for the Forestry Commission. But to allow someone, whether it's the Highways Agency or anybody else, to tick the no box and get a felling license, which then circumvents the tree preservation order system, seems wrong. The Forestry Commission tried to get around this by putting a note on their felling licenses for several years. If you have not declared the existence of a tree preservation order or conservation area when making the felling application, any felling license subsequently issued will not cover the felling of trees to which a tree preservation order applies or which are in a conservation area. And that's disappeared from the felling license I've got here from earlier this year. But just as a slight, it's a very minor issue, but the issue of conservation areas actually is different from tree preservation orders. So the Forestry Commission lump in conservation areas with tree preservation orders and felling license. So please tell us if there's a conservation area. There's no law to say they need to do that. There's no law that says that if they've got a felling license, that it allows you to cut trees down in a conservation area. Of course, most conservation areas are of an urban architectural nature. So I wonder how many felling licenses are required in conservation areas. But all the same, whilst the Forestry Commission put that on the application form, the applicant doesn't have to declare a conservation. It's convenient for them because the Forestry Commission will then notify the local authority. But it doesn't, as I say, conservation area is not mentioned in the legislation with regards to felling licenses.
Jon, that's been so fascinating going through that in detail. I wonder if you could just encapsulate your thoughts on this.
So the Forestry Act 1967 is born of another age, when the Forestry Commission was given every copy of every TPO. Things were done in writing. And we are now obviously quite some way down along many years later. And the Forestry Commission have far fewer staff than they used to have. And what appears to be a necessity for the Forestry Commission to find out, this is obviously in England, to find out if there is a tree preservation order, has led them to become reliant on applicants stating whether there's a TPO or not. And that doesn't seem to be a sure way of identifying whether there's a tree preservation order or not for the Forestry Commission to consider a felling license. I think something needs to change. It needs to improve. How that is done requires some conversation between two ministries or just within the Forestry Commission as to whether they can improve practices efficiently. Clearly, some local authorities find it much easier to identify whether there's a TPO or not. This case just highlights the complexities of the situation. I don't think this judgment will lead to other judgments of a similar nature, but there is a risk because I wasn't in the court. I don't know what was said either to the judge or by the judge, but it doesn't sound right. And obviously Julian said there are all sorts of implications because, this is the law and all these cases have gone in the past. Well, that'll be good luck to him. That's all I can say is I don't think it holds any water and we'll see where it gets to. But as I say, I think that the main thing is that there needs to be some interaction with the Forestry Commission to improve their procedures to make sure that felling licenses aren't issued which don't follow due process.
Jon, thank you so much. It's been great to hear another point of view. So if anybody's listening to this from the Forestry Commission or has a different point of view, do get in touch. noel@treeladytalks.co.uk.
And I know that everybody in the ARB community at least is looking forward to the updated Law of Trees, Forests and Hedges by Dr. Charles Miners, Stephanie Hall and Elizabeth Nichols, which is out imminently. Might be a bit of bedtime reading, you never know. Our next episode is a celebration of a collaboration with the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Silver Foundation, where a diverse group of participants created beautiful objects from wood. That's next on Tree Lady Talks.